Hello everybody, thank you Robert, and thank you to Water New Zealand for this opportunity to speak to you all. I want to do a couple of things this morning. I'm going to talk about water safety plans. I'm going to talk about the Havelock North Water Safety Plan a little bit, but first I want to talk about water safety planning in New Zealand and a little bit about that and where we've come from and how it's worked out. So the first water safety plan that I'm aware of in New Zealand was actually prepared for the Masterton drinking water supply back in 2003 when Cryptosporidium was identified in the reticulation system for that supply. And there was a number of issues identified with that supply and the reasons for the contamination event. And part of the response was a requirement that the District Council prepare a water safety plan for that supply. So we launched into this idea of risk management straight away, and there were some issues, and you can see here, and when I look at it now, I think, how did this happen? So the pictures there, that's a treated water reservoir. That's a hole dug in the gravel with a roof put over the top of it, and it comes complete with resident avian livestock living in there. And needless to say, a pretty high chlorine demand. So that was our first water safety plan. So excuse me a minute, sorry, that table was obscuring my view of my own presentation. So about this time, the Ministry of Health launched into a whole lot of resources around water safety plans and water safety planning. So there was DVDs, a couple of DVDs, there was booklets, there was a framework, and there was kits that were made to help people, and the kits had templates that people would use. So there was a lot of resources produced by the Ministry of Health. And then we had the guides on how you could prepare a water safety plan, and they were largely around risk tables, and they had these kind of risk tables that were available for people to use. And then that kind of culminated in 2007 with legislative change which introduced in the legislation a requirement for a water supplier to prepare a water safety plan. And those water safety plans were required to identify public health risks, mechanisms for preventing and reducing and eliminating those risks, critical points, information on costs and benefits, which is interesting because that wasn't part of the original legislation but was introduced in the select committee stage, and it shows you how political considerations and concerns can end up in legislation that's about a technical matter and a timetable for managing those risks. The key thing about that was that at that point in time, New Zealand was a bit of at the forefront of this whole idea around water safety plans and managing risk in water supplies. And that was largely due to one person. That was Dr. Michael Taylor, who was involved with the WHO, came back from the meetings that Steve Hrudi talked about, and said to us, working in public health in the ministry, here's a new idea, we need this idea, we're going to do this. And Michael set about putting together all these resources and getting this thing going, and we owe a considerable debt to him for the work that he did. And since then, there's been hundreds of water safety plans written in New Zealand. And they largely follow a pretty similar format. So generally you find at the beginning they'll have a document version, and they'll have a bit of an introduction, and often people talk about the legislative requirements and the ideas of water safety plans. Personally, I don't think that's necessary, but a lot of people put it in. And then there's normally a supply description: where does the water come from, what's the treatment processes, etc., etc. There's often some photographs and a bit of a schematic about how the system works. A little bit of talk often about critical points and barriers, not critical control points. I'm going to come back to that because that's an important point about the way we've done water safety plans. There's a bit about methodology, how we put the plans together, and a reference to those framework documents from the Ministry of Health. You're required to talk about the consultation you've undertaken and how the plan's been put together, who you talked to, what they said. And then the engine room of any water safety plan, which is the risk tables or risk register. And that's the place where you set out what are the risks, are they managed, is there something else we need to do, and you answer those fundamental questions about water safety plans. When I talk to people about water safety plans, Basically, there's a few fundamental questions. What could go wrong? How would you know it was going to go wrong? And what are you going to do to make sure it doesn't go wrong? And so the risk tables are important in doing that. And then we have contingency plans, and the contingency plans set out what you're going to do if you get a bit of a disaster occurring or looks like things are going a bit pear-shaped. And of course, an improvement plan which outlines what you're going to do. And as I said, there's been hundreds written. And by and large, my view is that they've resulted in considerable water system improvements and upgrades. And by and large, they've resulted in a considerable reduction of risk in New Zealand water supplies. Now, that's not to say it's complete or been as effective as it could be, but it has made a difference, and it has been very important. So what I want to do now is talk about the Havelock North situation in respect to its water safety plan. And before I do that, I'm just going to have a quick recap of the Havelock North supply. So it's a combined supply with Hastings and Havelock North. There's a bunch of groundwater sources. There's 5 zones, and either they can be combined or they can be supplied separately. And so Havelock North's zone, or part of that supply, can be supplied by a bunch of bores that are specific to the Havelock North zone. The supply was assessed as complying with the secure bore water criteria of the drinking water standards. So that's an important point. It's a very important point, because clearly there was an issue. And there was an issue with the supply, but there was clearly an issue with the standards as well. And so the fact that it complied with those criteria in the standards is pretty important. One of those bores had been closed in 2015 because E. coli had been identified within that bore. And there had been a Campylobacteriosis outbreak in 1998 for the same supply, and there had been numerous E. coli positive results over a number of years. So if you look at the graphic, and this is from the Water Safety Plan, you can see here you've got the different zones, so Bridgepower and Hastings, and up the top there's Havelock North, and it's got the Brookvale bores out to the left there, and it's got its own reservoirs, and it's not an unusual situation for New Zealand. We have a number of supplies like this. So what went wrong? And we've covered this briefly, and some of you will know this, so I'll go through it pretty quickly. There's a couple of scenarios about what went wrong. Most likely is that Maungatiritiri stream became contaminated with sheep feces. There's a pond in that stream, and that's a picture of it. The pond drains to the aquifer. We know that because this picture, that water's not normally that colour. It's had dye put in there to trace the path or the flow of water to the bores, and so the dye's put in there, the bores are pumped, and eventually the dye turns up in the bores. So that's confirming the link between the two. The Brookvale Road bore in question is only 11 metres deep. So that's a shallow bore for secure bore water. It abstracts and supplies the contaminated water from the aquifer, and as you all know, there's no treatment barrier. So what I want to do next is talk about an alternative possibility, and that's so this comes from stage 1 of the inquiry, and that's what is that heavy rainfall carries the water that's contaminated with sheep feces into a drain. It drains along by the bores and floods the bore chambers. So that was a less likely scenario, but also a possibility. So I said that the drinking water secure status is important here, and so I want to have a wee look at that, just so we're all clear about it. The status in the Drinking Water Standards 2008, and I remember this well when we were working on this and writing it, and there's a lot of discussion about these criteria, and it's based on this. First up, residence time. Water's been underground for a long time, should have no microbiological pathogens in it, and you demonstrate that you've got a decent residence time with a residence time test, and you have to repeat that every 5 years. The bore depth, generally bores for secure status had to be more than 30 metres, but in some circumstances 10 to 20 metres deep was acceptable. You had to have a sanitary borehead, so that's a borehead that doesn't allow the ingress of surface water into the bore. No E. coli, and you've got to keep your stock away 5 metres. So that's the secure bore water status that the Brookvale bores complied with, or should I say, had been assessed as complying with. So, what does the Water Safety Plan say about the situation in Havelock North? And I've got to be very careful here because hindsight, as you know, is a wonderful thing, and it's very easy to criticise something in hindsight. And so you can look at something after an event and you can pick holes all over the place because you have that knowledge. The Water Safety Plan was written without the benefit of hindsight. And so it's a point we have to be very careful. And so when I go through the points in the Water Safety Plan, the other thing I've done is I've picked out just some phrases from it that illustrate some things that I want to illustrate. But I want to point out that I'm not criticising the individuals that wrote this Water Safety Plan, and I'm not criticising the council that accepted the Water Safety Plan, and I'm not criticising personally the DWAs who approved the Water Safety Plan. I'm just wanting to make these points, and some of them are quite alarming because the points in the Water Safety Plan illustrate the larger points that I want to make. So let's have a wee look. First up, the Water Safety Plan talks about the source water, and it says high quality, very high quality, such high quality, very high quality. In other words, it's based on the idea that the source water is very, very good. It's groundwater, it's very, very good. In fact, the plan says that the council was fortunate having secure groundwater source. So that's very interesting because the aquifers are also considered as secure. Now you won't find a definition of secure groundwater or a secure aquifer in the drinking water standards. The standards talk about secure bore water. It's an important point because I remember when we were working through this with David Ogilvie, who wrote this part of the standards, that it doesn't matter what the quality of your water might be underground. If you can't extract it without contaminating it, it's of very little use to you in a water supply if you aren't going to have a treatment barrier. So there's a little confusion about these terms in the Water Safety Plan. The other thing is, what is a secure aquifer? So parts of an aquifer might have water that's old and not microbiologically contaminated, but not all of an aquifer can have that because there must be a point at where water enters an aquifer and it can't be secure at that point. So the idea of a secure aquifer is a bit of a misnomer for me. It goes on to say all wells in the Hastings Havelock North area believed to be capable of achieving secure status, although formal confirmation from the Ministry of Health needs to be sought. So this supply was assessed as complying with the Drinking Water Standards secure bore water criteria, but the Water Safety Plan says, hang on, it hasn't had final confirmation from the Ministry of Health. So you can see automatically there's a bit of a problem there. Could be classed as secure, can be considered secure, have not yet been granted secure status in accordance with the Drinking Water Standards. So we go from saying very high quality water, to saying could be secure, but hasn't been identified as such. The other thing that happens is in the risk tables talk about an event that the wells are not secure and identifies the need to undertake works to obtain security of all wellheads. And then contaminated water getting into the bore from the surface, an event, they need a budget to do extra work. And the aim is to achieve secure bore water status. So while the Water Safety Plan says the source water is very high quality, it also identifies that there's issues with abstracting the source water from where it is a really high quality. So for a Water Safety Plan to do that, there becomes a little bit of a tension for me around the quality of the water once it's been abstracted. So to focus in the plan there is on two things. One's the quality of the water underground, but the fact that there's some issues around the bores. So if we go further into the plan, we find a number of other things that the plan says. And one of them is that HDC is required to find an alternative source to mitigate the effects on the nearby Maungatieri stream. And unfortunately, Regional Council accepted claims that the take had potential adverse effects. So these points in the Water Safety Plan are telling me that there's a connection between the Maungatieri pond and the aquifer. Now, if that's the case, how can the water in the aquifer be of very high quality? There must be a risk. There must be a risk that surface water is contaminating. And we know that it was the case. So these tensions develop in the Water Safety Plan between different things that are being raised. And it says, Council will continue to pressure the Regional Council to meet its obligations regarding the NES. And I wonder about that word pressure, because the Water Safety Plan is supposed to be a collaborative approach. It's supposed to be a collaborative approach of organisations working together to resolve and manage risks in a water supply. So there's a few things there that raise some concerns for me. As we go further into the plan, into the risk register, we find some other things that are very inconsistent. And one of them is this. So the risk register uses this likelihood consequence process for figuring out a level of risk. And it's kind of like, my personal experience of this is that it has real difficulties, this likelihood consequence. It's difficult to make it work all the time. But it's what we use, it's what the Ministry of Health have recommended. So the risk plan says, here's an event, source water, the aquifer, receives faecal matter from livestock or feral animals. And so it says the risk of that is, and I've cut and pasted this directly from the plan, almost certain and insignificant. So what does almost certain mean? Well, it means it's expected to occur in most circumstances. So how does that square with water of very high quality? If you're expecting it to occur in most circumstances, that it would be contaminated with surface water. And then the plan says the consequence of that, the consequence of the aquifer being contaminated with fecal material would be insignificant. And what is insignificant? No apparent impact. Now, everybody in this room would know that a contaminated aquifer contaminated with fecal matter from animals, for a water supply that has no treatment barrier, would not be no impact. So there's these issues around consistency about the way the Water Safety Plan was put together. One of the other things there, as well as the indicators for action, the source water has more than 1 E. coli per 100 mils. Well, as we all know, by the time you find 1 E. coli or more in a water supply, you can take action, but it's still too late. And so we need a better way of figuring out what action we're going to take. E. coli monitoring is not a risk management technique. It's a verification procedure, and it verifies that your risk management procedures are working. It's not a risk management procedure in and of itself. So there's a few things. So what are the wider issues that the Water Supply Safety Plan highlights? And the first is communication between organisations. And we know that the Stage 1 inquiry found issues with communication between a lot of organisations throughout Hawke's Bay and with the preparation and management of the water supply. We found that there were some infrastructure issues around the boreheads and a lack of clarity about the quality of the source water. That's a real issue. So that might be okay if you've got a treatment barrier, but if it's not, if you don't have a treatment barrier, you must be very clear about the quality of your source water and the risks associated with that source water. The last one there is, and clearly, a failure to identify, quantify and manage risk. So what is the function of a water safety plan? It's to identify, quantify and manage risk. That's the job it must do. So we must ask the question, why didn't this water safety plan manage to do that? and I've been through the whole thing, and I come to the conclusion that it's this. In many respects, this water safety plan, and again, I'm not pointing the finger at individuals, didn't ask the question, what could go wrong? What it sought to do was to show that nothing could go wrong. And so the approach of the water safety plan was to demonstrate that the water supply was safe, rather than to ask the question, is this water supply safe? So it leads us to the obvious conclusion then, is there something we need to change? Well, is our water safety plan a risk management tool, or has it become a compliance requirement? And I would suggest that a water safety plan that seeks to tell us that there is no problem is trying to be a compliance document rather than a risk management tool. And so this is a common situation, and I think it's one of the real downfalls about risk management planning and water safety plans in New Zealand. So a typical situation is I'm a consultant, I get a call, someone rings up, they say, we've had the drinking water assessor here, they said we need a water safety plan for our supply, we need to update the water safety plan, can you do that? And as a consultant, my answer is always, yes, of course we can. So we fall into this trap, I think, of seeing water safety planning as a compliance measure rather than a risk management tool. The other thing is that I think our water safety plans have focused on treatment barriers rather than other things. Rather than catchment, risk protection, source water protection, it's been very focused on treatment barriers. And in many cases, water safety plans have been prepared for us rather than with us or by us. And by the us, I mean water suppliers. So those are things that I think we need to change, and we need a much more collaborative approach to the way we prepare water safety plans. So I'm just going to miss through that bit, and I just want to finish up with the UN Sustainable Development Goals, because these are relevant. And so we had Millennium Development Goals, and people thought, yeah, they were largely intended for developing countries and developing country situations. The UN Sustainable Development Goals are for all countries, and the New Zealand government supports them. And there's a number of them, there's 17 I think in all, and the sixth one there is water and sanitation, safe water and sanitation for all. And you might think, well, in New Zealand, is that relevant to us? Well, Darfield 2012 tells us it is, and Havelock North as well. But also integrated water resources management. And so here we are talking about sustainable management of water supplies, catchment risks, catchment management, and a focus on integrating those organisations relevant and important in that space. The last thing I'd like to say, and just finish up with, I know I'm running out of time, is that if someone said to me, is there a problem, and I think there are problems, though in saying that there's a lot of things that have been good, where did that problem arrive and how did it arise? And I go back to 2008 actually, and with the retirement of Dr. Michael Taylor from the Ministry of Health, because when Michael retired, we lost our international links. We lost a lot of our international links, and we lost our leadership in the water industry, a lot of our leadership. And I think that if we want to improve our position, bearing in mind that at the time that Michael was at the ministry, we were at the forefront of this work. We need to re-establish those international links, and we need to refine some leadership in this industry to assist us with this process of providing safe water supplies. And I might say that today is a very important step in the direction of those two things. Thank you very much.